Right, good morning, welcome back to the podcast, Strangford Management podcast. We've got a very special guest with us today. I'm going to go through his credentials very quickly because he has got a lot of them. So he is the owner of Hortons Valuers, director of Project and Coast Surveyors, founder of Leasehold Social, founder of the 1000 Club, Rick's Registered Valuer, entrepreneurship mentor, property investor, Apple top 10 podcaster, original online property influencer, multi-award winner, and someone I consider a close friend of mine, Mr. Colin Horton.
Thank you, mate.
After all that, thank you for coming in. I don't know how you find the time.
I don't know, but if I'm ever single again, you can write my dating profile.
You're welcome.
That would be lovely.
That would be good. Yeah, I don't know if I can fit that into sort of 100 words on some app. So
would you swipe right?
We'll talk about that later. So,
that's a no.
I'll pass. So today we're going to talk about leasehold reform. There's lots and lots of changes going on in the industry at the moment. The government being wonderful about things and obviously being very open, saying lots of great things and then retracting on them. So I think if we talk about some of the ideas and something that's coming down the pipeline, it would be good because I think a lot of people don't really know about it. So first and foremost, let's talk about lease extensions. So what the government have said at the moment is they're going to allow 990-year leases as a right, and they're going to abolish marriage value. I know you work with a lot of developers, a lot of freeholders. I know you work on the leaseholder side as well, but I think just from this sort of perspective, it'd be amazing to get your thoughts on mainly what freeholders and I guess developer investors are looking at when they're seeing things like a right to automatically have 990-year leases and the abolition of marriage value. So what's your perspective, I guess, with your knowledge of your clients? What are they thinking at this point with this?
So I'm actually a freeholder myself.
Okay.
So I can speak quite...
Sorry, I didn't add that to the list.
Oh, no, it's only a little one. And we're actually working with the Residential Freeholders Association at the moment. So just so you guys know, my background was actually working in-house at one of the largest freeholders in the country. And my opinions potentially may be deemed as ever so slightly biased towards the freeholder cause.
Okay.
But that's only because I probably sit on a more capitalist mentality than I do on kind of everything should be equal and fair. So the freeholders as it stands have all been pretty good with helping the government as much as they can to get to this current situation. The thing that people don't seem to understand is that most of the freeholders' grant portfolios are actually now owned by pension funds.
Yeah.
So when everyone just assumes that these freeholders are being ultra greedy and, you know, not necessarily cooperating with people, it's actually because their hands are pretty much tied.
Yeah.
Without going too much into it, they would have been how the investments tend to work is there's two prongs. There's the lease extension income, and there's the ground rent income. And what the majority of these freeholders did is they refinanced their ground rent income. And the simplest way, for the easiest way to explain it, would be a price someone has paid to have that ground rent income in perpetuity. Where most of these pension fund deals between 30 and 70 years. Right. And they got paid this massive lump sum up front at discount rates that were far beyond what you'd maybe see in a standard lease extension. So what's happened now, I hope people are still listening because the maths, I did switch off at school when I was doing discounted cash flows. But fundamentally, the issue we've got very simply is that when the freeholders are now doing lease extensions, they need to fundamentally fill the hole that will occur by getting rid of that, by extending the lease to a 90-year or 990-year term with a peppercorn ground rent. It's fundamentally going to wipe the value out of that asset. So they need to adequately compensate themselves and subsequently the funds to make sure that they're getting what they can basically fill the hole. Not every freeholder's done this, but what's happened is the cases that tend to go to tribunal now will be generally the ones backed by the bigger pockets.
Right.
And those decisions over the last few years, I'm a bit of a skeptic, and I'll explain why in a sec, but the decisions have all pretty much gone in favour of the freeholder. So a lot of case law now supports freeholders' decisions, only up until very recently, especially impacts marriage value, which is a point you touched on. Marriage value is arguably the biggest part of a lease extension premium sub 80 years. So above 80 years, there's no marriage value. You're simply compensating the freeholder for their loss of reversionary value, which is how much does someone pay today to get that flat at the end of the lease and their loss of ground rent income. So how much will someone pay today for that ground rent income throughout the rest of the lease term? When it goes below 80 years, you get marriage value, and that tends to probably make up probably 50% of the premium.
Right.
Now, Mr. Gove, I think he was one of the housing ministers at the time that came out of this, actually, no, it wasn't Gove, it's been ages ago now, clickbait status saying we're going to get rid of marriage value. Now, fundamentally, by doing that, it would hemorrhage the value of, I'm sitting here, Mike's sitting here, we've probably got pension funds that actually actively invest in ground rents. I'm sure the listeners will have that as well. So by doing that, you're actually hemorrhaging the value of these people's assets subconsciously without actually realising. So I completely went off on a tangent there, actually. I don't actually know.
Well, how are freeholders going to try and fill that gap? It sounds like this runs slightly deeper than, we want to make it fairer for leaseholders, which Michael Gove has come out and said, which is fair. I think it's a fair comment. However, if this runs a few layers deeper and it runs to pension funds and people's investments, how do you think, or what do you know that freeholders are, what ideas are they coming up with to say, actually, we're going to fill that gap by doing X, Y, and Z? So
the original cause of all this court controversy, lobbying about leasehold, was the 10-year Dublin ground rents and the 10-year RPIs.
Yeah.
All the freeholders now have signed a pledge to fundamentally remove that Dublin clause.
Yeah.
Massive make-whole payments. The pension funds haven't agreed to that generally. It's generally the freeholders themselves and the house builders. So that was the first stage that came in, and I actually thought that would have been enough really to placate the lobbyist groups.
I think everyone sort of said this is right.
Yeah,
like that was insanity. And looking at the numbers that were coming out saying, in X amount of years this person's going to have to pay 1.2 million in ground rent. It was insanity.
There is logic though, Mike, to that.
Right.
So if you look back at, say you had a ground rent and a house price in 1950 works, and you ran them up together, the percentage increase on the house prices compared to a 10-year Dublin ground rent is far more.
Right.
So house prices have actually outstripped Dublin over every 10 years, over the last 70 years.
Right.
That's why that logic was initially put in place.
Okay.
Obviously, when you look at it far afield, how much can things double? But
you could argue that's apples and oranges, really. You could slightly argue it's comparing two different things.
It is a bit,
sort of an investment.
There is a logic.
But I can see at the time when it was first written, and bear in mind we're talking like 50 years ago now, like plus. At the time it was written, it probably seemed actually this is quite a logical step. So you can see both sides.
And I think with the Dublin ground rents, the reason they became so prominent was when freehold ground rent investment became very lucrative, because ultimately any debt over 350 quid, 300 quid, whatever it is, you can forfeit the flat. Yeah. So it's a bloody secure asset. So you can see why freeholders were going nuts trying to buy these ground rent assets and then refinance them. But in terms of moving forward, there's going to be huge human rights issues.
Yes.
And fundamentally, you can't. I've got a freeholder. It's nothing major. It's two little reversion reunions. If they got rid of marriage value, that was half the value of that freehold.
Sure.
I'm not a greedy landlord. I accumulated that freehold by luck in a purchase. And there's going to be thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the same boat. I do not think it's fair to actively take, Robin Hood, rob from the rich and give to the poor. I'm not saying I'm rich. I'm not saying they're poor, but that shift in wealth, I don't think is fair.
Sure. But I think that's also, it's a good point to bring up, because I think it's a narrative that's possibly media driven.
Correct.
And I'm not going to fire that at all the media, but I think it's every leaseholder is poor, every landlord is rich. And actually we could almost argue the opposite is slightly more true, certainly in London. You could say, actually, hang on a sec, there's a lot more freeholders that are just average people, and there are leaseholders that are extremely wealthy. So I think this narrative is very one-dimensional from the media, and that's feeding into this sort of frenzy of we need to abolish everything, we need to abolish leasehold, we need to abolish this and get rid of any costs involved in extension, and get rid of marriage value, and without looking a few layers deeper and saying, actually, hang on a sec, this is going to destroy pension funds, it's going to destroy assets for companies, it's going to have human rights issues, it's going to have company issues, it's going to have people's job issues coming through because they're not going to exist anymore. So yeah, I think it's a slightly naive narrative being pushed by the media on this one.
Yeah, I think you've got to look at the circumstances. The government are failing at the moment.
Sure.
They need some votes.
Yeah.
They may be looking at the lobbyist groups tended to start up north. They're now all over the country, and they've done a great job in raising awareness for leasehold. But at the same time, it's actually had a pretty detrimental impact on leasehold, because no nobody wants to buy a leasehold flat anymore.
Yeah.
They just Google it and it looks horrific. And couple that with the Building Safety Act, which I think we might touch on, and obviously Grenfell.
Yeah.
There's a lot of issues with leasehold that have created this perfect storm of, God, leasehold is horrific.
Yeah.
So the government, I know, are working with the freeholders as much as they can. Are they speaking to the right people? I don't know. I sometimes think the government are speaking to the loudest voices, not necessarily the wisest voices. A lot of the freeholders are, I'm helping the RFA out on the PR side of things, because I think, unfortunately, there is an impression that the RFA is just an old male, pale, stale association. Fundamentally, it's not, it's not necessarily someone that's down on the ground, knows what's going on. So I'm trying to help them a little bit on that front. But there's the people that seem to be getting in front of the MPs are the ones on these lobbyist groups, and I worry that the government at the moment aren't actually forward thinking and planning what will happen after legislation comes in. So we have to get rid of marriage value.
So just reacting to the loudest voices as opposed to actually having a proper strategy.
Court cases, there were loads of appeals.
Sure.
Everyone's sales and subsequently going to be in jeopardy and waiting around. So the market's just going to subsequently
it's a mortgage time bomb really as well.
Yeah, which is going to affect everything. And it's not just leasehold. That's then going to affect people's houses because it's the bottom of the chain, mortgages. So it's just, I don't know. It's a bit frustrating sitting there, especially as an RICS, practitioner. I don't necessarily know how much involvement they're having.
Yeah.
Again, it's that very much the old male power style mentality. I don't think there's enough voices out there. I think everyone out there is trying to protect themselves.
Of course, yeah, and I guess that's human nature as well.
Are people trying to actually think of the big picture? I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the next point I had was discuss ground rents. I know it's abolished for ground rents for new leasehold, but I suppose we've touched upon that slightly in what we've just been talking about. So I don't know if we need to sort of go into that. I think it's the same cause, same effect. I think the abolition of ground rents has had a detrimental effect on the value of assets, and I think the extension of that, I mean, it was more speculation. I was thinking, would they possibly extend that backwards in some way?
Retrospectively.
But I don't.
Yeah, the only thing it has done, mate, so what we do, I work probably 50-50 leaseholders, freeholders, is a lot of leaseholders would have taken what's called the non-statutory lease extension, or the informal one, where they would have taken an improved ground rent in return for an adjusted premium, decrease. And obviously, if you're moving, you don't really care too much what the ground is if you move and you want to save some money. They've now taken that away. And I do think that was perhaps a little bit short-sighted. I think they could have implemented, restrictions on types of reviews. But we don't just need to keep going over the ground rent.
But again, I suppose we always we seem to hark back in the last couple of minutes of the government again have listened to the loudest voices, which is, I don't disagree with some of the voices they've listened to, but I think you're right. There's no long-term strategy to it. This sounds like a problem. What's the best solution we can think of right now? Rather than saying, let's try and talk to all the voices and come up with something that, it can exist for a very long period of time. Yeah, I mean, controversially, mate, I don't actually think ground rents are a problem now at all. Okay. We've made them a problem. Right. Banks them. I mean, realistically, we're talking about, say there's a flat was worth 250 grand and a ground rent £400 a year, right? That's now apparently deemed as a problem because it's above 0.1%. Yeah. We're not really addressing the fact that, mortgage rates are through the roof. I mean, we're talking at 160 quid a year or whatever. And I know, it's not a lot of money. I mean, it's a night out, it's around the drinks, So I do think there's a hell of a lot more important things in the property sector that we do need to be focusing on. For sure. And, it comes down to property management, regulating that. And obviously not every agent's as good as you and has the same, protocols. There's a lot of people coming in saying they're doing it. They can't actually do it. I think it's other things they need to be focusing on, but is it sexy? I don't know. I'm not sure. So I did tell you I was going to be quite open on this podcast. So. No, you're good. I appreciate it for it as well. And I think just one thing that wasn't really on my list to talk about was the regulation of property management. And I think I'm, for one, put on record, I'm for it. I can see that the benefits of having some sort of licensed regulation type system in place. I think a lot of the problems that are highlighted in the media or by highly vocal individuals stem from poor management or poor systems and regulation management as opposed to poor structure of the industry. I know a lot of my sort of fellow owners in block management feel quite similar, and they've been very vocal about saying this is something we need, we want it, please come and regulate us and license us and whatever you want. But we just never seem to get heard enough. And I don't think it's even that difficult to put that into play. I think these things that we're talking about are a lot more complicated than regulating an industry. We've got Armour, which is great, but it's self-regulatory. And I think, a lot of leaseholders have maybe relied on Armour for regulating or enforcing regulation on property management companies when it's just not strong enough to do so. You hear all these horror stories of, because they take membership money from us, from property management companies, you hear these horror stories of something bad will happen and Armour should be enforcing X, Y, and Z, but they don't necessarily go to the extent that they should because then they will lose membership money. And it's I don't want to reach out and say, hey, Armour are corrupt. I think Armour are doing the best job that they can do. But it's a very, very big difference between an actual formal regulatory independent body. I think that's something that really needs to come in. And maybe Armour can transition into that. That would be probably the easiest way to do it. But I think something is definitely needed. And I think it's time to do that and time to focus on that. And I think that would genuinely solve a lot of problems. I think I saw a post on LinkedIn the other day and someone was saying how he found it so terribly insane that you could just wake up one morning and start a block management company and that's it. You don't necessarily need that much money. You don't need that much intelligence.
They say they're doing that and I'm sitting
there. You just sit there and think, oh, here we go again. And that's when you start to get these bad reputations. I'm like, but there needs to be a barrier of entry. And we're not saying let's make it insane, but let's do something. Let's have some sort of entry exam. Go to the American model. You can't do anything to do with like property over there, or on a very, very low level. You can't really do anything unless you're licensed. Great. And you've got to put in a certain amount of hours before you can take the
license.
Yeah. You've got to get your brokerage license. And it's almost a case of, okay, well, let's make people do 30 hours of training minimum and then take a short exam just to have an entry into the industry. There's no harm in that. That doesn't take a lot of...
Even the RPM stuff, I mean, it's like...
Again, they're doing the best they can, but you see a lot of people, and from my perspective as well, I would love to bring in something like that. I don't want to go off on this wholly, but we are. I would love to see that because a lot of the times when you're sort of recruiting people, it's actually really hard to see the difference in people. You're almost solely basing it on length of time served and character of person. We do tests now to try and test people and see where they are on different sort of levels, but it would be so much easier if there was a licensing structure, because then we could say, oh, actually, you're at this level, you're at this particular banding, you've had exposure to X, Y, and Z because you're licensed to have exposure to X, Y, and Z. So I think there's just a lot that can easily be brought in. I say easily so flippantly, like, yeah, just do it tomorrow. But, I think if there was some dedication to a particular cause like licensing, I think it would make a big, big difference.
Agreed.
So yeah, that's my take anyway. Next point, change of the qualification for enfranchisement claims. Now, just people don't know, at the moment, if a building has 25% of non-residential use, so generally commercial use, they, as a building, don't qualify to enfranchise. I think the idea or speculation is to possibly move that to 50%, which would capture so many more buildings. First and foremost, I'd be very interested to see the difference, the numbers, see actually how many buildings can't qualify and then how many buildings would that encompass. So I think it's something that the government would bring in to allow enfranchisement to be a lot easier. And enfranchisement is the leaseholders effectively buying the freehold to the property, to the development. So again, that would be an asset transferring from a freeholder to a leaseholder body corporate. Is there any discussion at all with your clients about we're nervous about this, or is it purely we still get money from the asset? I think
most freeholders accept the fact that now change is coming.
Sure.
And they do generally want to work with the leaseholders. Like, despite what people may think, they do generally want to work with them. So in terms of because there was two elements, wasn't there, on this, was it's about 25% participation. Mm-hmm. So that makes sense for me, because I do feel it can be very prohibitive, the 50%, especially on some of the bigger blocks.
Sure.
And I don't think the freeholders would have any objection to that. And ultimately, it's not necessarily something that is going to financially affect them too much.
Sure.
But the only place it would affect them is of the loophole where it's discussed that if that is non-participating in the enfranchisement and there's no, in inverted brackets, intention for them to do a lease extension, now we know that's often just a ruse, that there's no marriage value payable or a small percentage is payable. So if you look at it that way, there may be the chance where these freeholds might not be as worth as much as they would be under the 50% rule. But on the whole, I don't think freeholders are going to have an objection to that. I mean, some of the blocks now on the non-commercial element side of things, that I remember some of the blocks we've worked on were designed purely to make them unenfranchisable.
Right.
I've been on stuff where we've had to measure the building to like the millimetre because it's been
really?
close
To make
it non-qualifying.
Wow.
So, but again, that was a few years ago. The world's changed now, and a lot of these freeholders are now changing their business model and shifting them into other assets. And, I think they're looking more where else they can generate income from, or even look at other things, and you won't go off. I won't go off on other subjects, but there's so many other things I think the freeholders are more concerned about. I think it's great. I think it's one of the best ones that the government have come out with in terms of the potential. It makes sense. It's actually a logical thing to do, and it's fair. The only thing we wouldn't want is just to have blocks. I live in a block of 9, so we'd need, as it currently stands, 5 to enfranchise. But unless you need 3. It's just whether or not you get people to take over. But then everyone has the right to join in. So it's. I think on the whole, mate, I think it's a good shout.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Just it's an easy fix that it sounds like freeholders aren't against. I want to echo as well what you said about freeholders generally don't mind working with leaseholders to have these particular rights and whether it's lease extensions or taking over the building and franchising it and such. I've certainly been on the other end where I've been working with, say, an RTM company that have had, all bloody murder with a freeholder to try and get that. So I've kind of seen both sides of it, but I would say I've seen more so freeholders saying, that's absolutely fine. Let's just work the process and we can sell the asset to you. So, I'd say it's more so a positive than a negative. And I think it is an easier thing to say, let's just relax the qualification measurements. And that's sort of good for everyone, really. The last one, and probably the one that I'd say has probably caused, certainly in my sphere, the most controversy is commonhold.
Yep.
Again, for those who haven't heard about this yet, I'm sure loads of you have, but commonhold is a different type of tenure. So leasehold and commonhold. Leasehold is where there's a separate freeholder. Commonhold is typically where the owners of the apartments, the leaseholders, are also the owners of the freehold. There is no third-party freeholder. It's seen across the world in Australia and you see it in sort of America and places. It's the more common one. I think the UK is pretty much the only ones that have this leasehold sort of structure. So the government, I think it was February this year, Michael Gove came out and said he wants to abolish leasehold, and then quickly ran back in on that comment a few months later and started ducking that confirmation. But it has caught a lot of momentum to say, actually, is commonhold the solution to this leasehold issue that everyone seems to be sort of talking about? And again, I would love to sort of hear your perspective and supported by, your clients of what they're thinking about commonhold. Is it good? Is it bad? Pitfalls? What can we think about it?
So commonhold itself is a lovely idea. It's a lovely idea. Of course it is. Everyone living in perfect harmony. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I'm all for that. However, I know how difficult it is to organise a lad's holiday to Kavos with 6 of my best friends, all have a shared goal. Imagine having a block of 100 units where some are owner occupied, some are not. Some have money, some don't. Having no top tier body on top of us to kind of control it, I just don't think it's going to work. I think the idea is lovely. It's a wonderful holistic idea, which of course it would be a beautiful place to be if everyone was on board. And I know it works in other countries, but unfortunately I just don't think it will work here. In terms of finances, freeholders, of course they're not going to want commonhold, but ultimately if something goes from freehold to commonhold, there's going to be a lot of money transferring to make these things happen. And also what I do think these guys forget is you can't just enfranchise and buy the block. Like, it's not actually that big of a deal. And, it's... Again, I just think it's an idea which, let's get rid of leasehold, let's get rid of leasehold. That's like, it's just a clickbait statement from the government again. And logistically, it's never going to happen. It's not possible. It won't work. There's literally no point in even putting any money on it happening. You might see more and more commonhold blocks come on, but I think it was 2002, the Commonhold Reform Act. And since then, I think there's a handful of blocks. I'd love to speak to someone that lives in one of the blocks, see how
Yeah.
they're getting on. But you've got to think of the logistics of getting a mortgage, pain in the arse. I mean, how many lenders are there that are going to lend on these common hold 10 years?
I suppose it's just on that point. I spoke to a lawyer a couple of weeks back, and they were mentioning if the government were to bring in common hold, it then creates a 2-tier system where you might have different premiums for mortgages for common hold and leasehold, and then it's all of a sudden, hang on, you've just created this real problem in the mortgage, in the mortgage sector. So I think a lot of people don't necessarily comprehend that. I think it's a nice idea. I agree. I think it's a really nice idea, and I think it's something that could be worked towards. But at times, I think it's maybe using a sledgehammer for a nail.
Yep.
I think working with, so I'd say the predominant of our portfolio is resident-led, leaseholder-led companies. And I see the ones that are highly functioning, and I see the ones that are not highly functioning. And the lack of leadership from someone in the body, in the company, has a real detrimental effect, because it stops us from getting proper instruction on what to do in the building or which decision to make in the building. We can make suggestions, but we need input from those companies. I think having leasehold transfer to common hold is a real serious issue. I think people don't understand, hang on a sec, there needs to be proper leadership. And then people fall back and say, well, actually, we need education in order to have leadership. And then we sort of go down the point of how many good managing agents out there have enormous resources for educating directors, but it just falls on deaf ears. We have significant amounts of PDFs and all sorts of documents, booklets that we hand out. Half the time we just say, well, you haven't read it. You don't understand, because we are saying we do X, Y, and Z, and you think we do A, B, and C. And we're the ones that gave you the booklet to say what we do and what we don't do. And I know, I remember all these ideas that came out probably around 2010, I think it was, of, before you buy a leasehold flat, there should be like an online course, like a home buyer's online course that someone has to sit and get a certificate for, that they've listened to, 6 hours of this is what, leasehold is. I'm kind of going back to that thinking maybe this is not the worst idea in the world. I know it's boring, and I know a lot of people wouldn't do it, but at the same time, it might be quite useful to say, actually, now I do understand the basics of leasehold or common hold. I know what my responsibilities are, because I don't think people will take on a responsibility of common hold. Certainly where we do buildings in London, people are exceptionally busy, and trying to get hold of someone to say, hey, can we sit down and make a decision on this? It's very, very hard at times. So then to say, well, now you're the ultimate party responsible for, dealing with, if you're then saying you're the ultimate parties responsible for this, I think it's going to cause problems.
Great.
And I don't think buildings will then be maintained to a standard that perhaps a freeholder can enforce an agent to maintain. I think that's going to be a big pitfall. Not saying it's the same for everyone. Like, we're not sitting here and triggering saying this is going to be the case and all blocks are going to be awful. It's not the case.
This is the thing.
It's going to be significant.
Speaking to people on the ground, I know the government are chatting to people, but again, they may be talking to the head of Armour or the head of the RPM. Great, they had practical experience to get to that point, or
sure.
We'd like to think they would. But speaking to guys like yourself who are actually actively working with right to manage companies, it's an absolute no-brainer. They have to do that. So it'd be interesting to see what happens. And as of anything, people think they're going to be escaping all these inserted clauses to pay fees and stuff. That's still going to be there. There's always going to be opportunities for people to make money out of these situations.
I think I saw you post a comment on a post a couple of weeks back, maybe, and someone was saying something about common hold, and I think you stepped in and said, hang on, the case that you're citing here seems to be poor management rather than a structural leasehold versus common hold issue.
You're correct. You're completely correct.
And I should have said something. I just skimmed over it, but sorry, I was doing something else. But at the same time, it was more, hang on, he's not wrong. Like, I was sitting there thinking, Colin's not wrong here. Your particular case was more of a point of, this is just awful management. And regulation of managing agents sorts that in part, but there needs to be more understanding about it, rather than saying, here, right now, you're all responsible for it. The freeholder, has a human rights case against you, against the government for this, but now you're ultimately responsible. We've had buildings where it's hard enough to get a director to step in. So, we've had buildings where they say, well, can you just be a third-party corporate director of the company? And we're like, well, not really. We don't really want to go down that route. We'd much rather you guys take responsibility for your own building. All of a sudden, if they're common hold, what do? No one wants to take any responsibility. So, there's definitely cases for it saying, okay, yes, in an ideal world, having everyone as sort of a freeholder is wonderful. And we work with leaseholder freehold companies, and it is wonderful because there is a really proactive chairperson, a really good solidified board that work, know the mem and arts, they know the inside and out of the lease, and they work with us to make it the best possible. And that's fantastic. The other side of the coin is where we can't even get a director to step in for the building. And all of a sudden you're now saying, okay, well, the solution to this problem is to make everyone responsible and all the best agents. There's a gap. There's a gap, and it's sort of one size doesn't fit all. And I keep saying this to everyone. I'm like, just because it works for you in that particular case doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone else in that particular case. So stop then saying, right, everyone's going to now be common hold. And then you kind of have all the human rights issues, then you have all the mortgage issues, the 2 tiers and all sorts coming out of it. So I don't know. I don't know if this particular government, or I know the Labour Party have said a lot about it as well. I don't know if either government have the right structure or have listened to enough people in order to make the best strategy to try and make something like this work. And I think there's smaller steps. I think build up to it, guys. Whether it's common hold or leasehold, regulate managing agents. It will work for both. So why not just do that as a first step, then like bed it in a little bit, see what happens. And then we can kind of come back and say, okay, well, we've taken the first step. It's done something better, but it's not quite to where we wanted to go to. And let's take the next step. My opinion.
Agreed. And especially just a last note, obviously, I'm all very much aware of, I keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening in property management. And obviously, I know there's big companies pretty much buying everyone at the moment, almost getting to a point where it's almost like a monopoly.
Yeah.
The amount of companies are buying.
Sure.
And the amount of salaries now that property managers are now being able to, agree because they're so competitive.
Yeah.
That amount of salary probably should be regulated.
Yeah.
You really should be regulated. So I guess a lasting comment from myself is government, I completely agree. Make small steps. It hasn't got to be overtly complicated. And unfortunately in life, not everyone's always going to be perfectly happy.
Yeah.
So just actually speak to guys like me, like Mike, but not, similar people, and actually find out what's going on the ground and actually just do a bit of forward planning.
Yeah.
But if you're thinking about buying a flat that has a leasehold, that has short lease, don't stress, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
In all my years of working with short leases, I've never ever seen the purchase price of a short lease under 8 years, when you add it to the lease extension cost, exceed what it would be worth with a long lease. Yeah. So it's designed to be profitable. Don't stress. Always speak to a surveyor. It doesn't have to be me, but there's other guys around there. Just take advice. Do your research, and if you are an RTM, make sure you use Strangford because they're the best.
Yeah. No, I think, look, it's this particular podcast, I think, has probably been, or maybe quite triggering to some people, and good. It's supposed to be
thought. Get some comments going.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's supposed to be thought provoking, and that's good if it is thought provoking. And we're trying to provoke people's thoughts so we can have a bigger and better conversation. So don't hold back. I think there's lots of comments, and everyone has the right to be heard, and we're certainly enforcing that right to bring this podcast to you guys. So, Colin, thank you so much for coming in today and having this chat.
No worries,
it's been really, really good, and we've covered a lot in a very short space of time. So, I'll pull some clips off so people can see the highlight reel, and we'll see from there. Thank you so much.
Clickbait there, mate.